Right. Good evening. Randy, how you doing? Yeah,
Hey, Kit.
yeah. Kit, how are you? Bob? Bob? Jim? Yeah. Ed?
Ed, hi, Andrea. That's all I see right now. Oh, and Jeff.
Mark, good to see you. Ed? Yeah. Mike?
I can talk.
Yeah, good.
Yeah.
Good evening.
Mike, you're on mute, but it's good to see you. There you are.
I was just going to give my part to Diane. Everybody else can read my lips.
Well, whatever you think would be most effective. I'm sure Diane would do a great job.
Oh, well, lots of credit.
Oh, well, nice to see you all. And Judy, good to see you. Oh, we have Kathy joining us, and Jim. Welcome.
I want you to know I got my book that the bookmark ordered the other day and sold several of them because I told them how wonderful this topic is to know about.
Oh, okay. Where was that, you say?
At the bookmark at church. Oh,
yeah, very good. Good. Do they have it in stock there?
Well, they ordered some, and I think I've already sold what they ordered out.
Oh, okay.
But I don't, they need to keep that on hand, that's for sure.
Yes, it's very, very timely, very relevant. Looking forward to our discussion this evening. So, Margarita, nice to see you. And Jeff?
So, Jeff, I think I told you, but I just wanted to let everyone know that in order for us to write a review, we had to buy a book. But I already had the proof, so we didn't need another book. So we sent it to our pastor instead.
Oh,
and
very good.
He is starting a 7-week series leading up to the election on the American Culture War, starting this Sunday.
Boy, you have a rare pastor, apparently.
Yes.
We have been very fortunate to find this church. So the first church that we were involved in, wasn't working out.
Right.
So, and we've really enjoyed, so they do a drive-in service, so we're able to go, and then we come home and join a Sunday school class on Zoom. A lot of people are meeting in person, but they set up a Zoom for us. We can't, Eric has students that are testing positive all the time, and they're not requiring the staff to quarantine, so we just are not hanging out with anybody else. So
yeah.
But anyway, I just wanted you to know that he is doing a sermon series based on your book. So
Well, that's very very encouraging. I think it's very impressive, not because it's my book, but because he cares and has the courage to deal with some of these controversial issues. Most pastors want to duck and cover.
yes. And he specifically made it right up into the Sunday before the election. So, and it's something that he'd been talking about, but I think that you really gave him some, format to lay it out to help put that together. So I was very excited.
Well, maybe I could make a trip down there sometime in the next couple of weeks and meet him.
You probably could, but you unfortunately can't see us. So,
well, I'll wave.
I don't want to make you. We don't.
I'll
we
honk
never
as
know.
I pass by your house.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm going to go read a chapter of The Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe, and then I will come back and join you.
Well, thanks, Andrea.
Okay.
And Kit, thank you. And it's good to see you all. We still have quite a number to join us. Wanda, nice to see you. And Rod. And I see Jim, Jane, Steve Lester. Very good.
I see Millie and Paul.
Yeah, there's Millie and Paul and Christy. Christy, good to see you. Yeah. David, Dean. Millie, I know we were going to start with some announcements in a few minutes. For the announcements, maybe Rod Nave would like to make an announcement about the upcoming RTB Zoom class, Zoom meeting next week. So perhaps we could work that in as well.
Muted, Jeffrey.
Pardon me?
Rod's muted.
Yes, Rod's muted.
Talking to us. There he is.
There we go.
Muted, and I was going to say, and I'll reiterate that we're looking forward to an outstanding session next week as Jeffrey goes through his book on C.S. Lewis. I love C.S. Lewis and studied that, so I'm looking forward to that session.
Absolutely. Rod, Millie will come back to you in just a few minutes when we have most everybody logged on. So I know I'm certainly looking forward to the session next week as well. Thanks. Brenda, nice to see you. I see you peering over Rod's shoulder.
I'm glad to be here.
Hey, Dolly.
Well, we'll start in a couple of minutes. Does anybody have anything they'd like to share just very briefly before we begin this evening?
Jeffrey, this is Jay.
Yes, Jay.
Give an update for this 40 days noonday prayer at Perimeter.
Yeah.
Decided to start on September 28th instead of 24th. There's a lot of other activities going on that weekend. So it's going to start on Monday, September 28th through November 2nd. And we are not going to have a prayer meeting on Saturday. So it's going to be Monday through Friday, starting from September 28th through November 2nd at 12 o'clock at the outdoor chapel at Perimeter Church.
How long do these sessions last?
1 hour, 12 to 1.
Okay. Very good. I'd like to come over at least once. Yeah. Well, I really think it's great that you initiated that. So we'll begin in just a couple of minutes, and when we do, Mark Buchanan, would you open us in prayer when we get started in a couple of minutes?
Be happy to.
Yeah, thank you.
We just finished Bible study at the church. Tell them we just finished Bible study at the church.
Well, I see it actually is a couple of minutes past 7 o'clock, so certainly most of those who will be joining us are logged on right now. So why don't we open with a prayer, and then I know Millie has some announcements before we get into our study. So as we go to the Lord in prayer, Mark, would you please lead us?
Certainly. Let us pray. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for this opportunity to gather as believers, and as believers in you and believers in Jesus Christ, and believers in everything he did for us and everything he continues to do for us. Open our hearts and minds to receive your teaching through Jeffrey tonight. Help us to understand and to assimilate what we learned tonight into an action plan that we can take out into the world and be salt and light in this world. Thank you for, again, this opportunity to gather. Not everyone in this world has the opportunity to gather in the way that we are tonight with fellow believers. we don't take that freedom lightly, and we hope to use our voices and our hearts and minds to change the trajectory of our country and of the world, to be more in line with your will. Lord, we ask this in your name. Be with us and guide us as we move forward from here and into the world. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Well, welcome to our study this evening. I know we still have quite a few who haven't logged on yet, but let's go ahead and begin with some announcements. And most of you know Millie Atkinson, and Millie is on our Areopagus Board of Directors. She also publishes the Watchman newsletter, which is just absolutely full of important upcoming events and articles related to pertinent issues and so on. And so she really has a valuable ministry, and we appreciate Millie so very much. And Millie, let me turn it over to you for a few minutes and pertinent announcements. Please go ahead. And you're currently muted.
All right. I like for people to hear me.
I'll vouch for that.
You'll vouch for that. It's good to see everyone, even in this digital platform here. It's not the same as being together, but it's certainly better than not meeting at all. So I'm so thankful that we have this resource. Jeffrey, I just wanted to thank you again for what you do. Your book is just such a treasure that you've compiled this. I know it was stressful getting it all together, but I just appreciate your perseverance and your family standing with you to get it done. I just wanted to mention to the group here, I know this is sort of like talking to the choir, because all on this group tonight are huge supporters of you, but I just wanted to remind people, if you will, share the book with those in your area of influence, whether it's family or friends, your pastor, whoever it might be. I'm so glad to hear Andrea about her pastor, and so many pastors don't want to talk about this. So I just encourage each one of you to do something, share it with someone. And if you're so inclined, to write a review for Jeffrey on Amazon, because apparently those reviews, that holds a lot of weight. So just consider that if that's something you might be inclined to do. Quite a few have already done that, and I know Jeffrey appreciates that very much. I think we all know that we're living in very interesting times, and it just seems like every day there's something, some new assault on the good, the true, and the beautiful around us. But we are placed here for such a time as this. I think about Acts 17:26. God knew that he would put us here. And I just appreciate Mark's prayer that, you know, may we do something with what we learned here under Jeffrey's teaching. Jeffrey had asked me to just comment on an article. He sent me several, but one I'm going to start with. You may have heard about it. Evangelical pastors pander to radical Black Lives Matter. That's just been one of my points of contention lately. Even watching the tennis over the weekend in New York, they had the Black Lives Matter sign up in the stands. And it's so maddening that people don't understand what that means. I loved a response from a little 13-year-old that I heard about. And I think we need to be prepared for what our response will be, because apparently they're coming up to people in restaurants and who knows where. So we must be prepared. And her response was, I'm an ally of the person, but I am not an ally of the movement. So I thought that was quite courageous of a 13-year-old. So I think we all need to be prepared. And Everett Piper in his article just mentions how so many Christian leaders, pastors, others in the Christian church are pandering to this movement, and there is nothing good about it. So I don't know if Jeffrey, you'll get that article out to the group or not, but they might be interested. And my point is we need to know about these matters. We are in this cultural time and we are really without excuse. We have so many resources to find the truth and then to share the truth in love. So we have people in our own family who they've bought into this lie. And I think it's very, very important. If your pastor doesn't know about it, and don't assume that they do, share with them. Al Mohler wrote an excellent article that's very fair, facts to the point, that you can share. So I do think that we all need to be informed about what is going on in this age in which we're living. We know it's all very strange, scary, frightening times, but we have been placed here for this time, and may we be used in a mighty way. So again, I think we are so privileged, as you all have heard me say before, and you know this too. I don't know of another ministry like yours, Jeffrey, and we are so privileged to be a part of that. And even if we're meeting by Zoom, that we can still meet and learn. And I just appreciate your passion of getting the word out. So thank you for that. I just want to mention again, I say this a lot, and you all know this, Jeffrey's ministry, the Areopagus, he and Dolly have sacrificed so much to bring this ministry to us. It is a faith-based ministry. They do not receive support from any church. They do that intentionally so that they can teach the truth, wherever it might be. And so we appreciate you stepping out in faith with that, Jeffrey. And so if anyone is financially able to support this ministry, please prayerfully consider that. We can get Jeffrey's address out. He operates on a shoestring to begin with, and this year, as you all are well aware, the donations to nonprofits such as this, it is a nonprofit, by the way, it's a 501c, the giving is down in many areas. So just keep that in mind as you do give. I think it is so important that we are very discerning on who we give to, what we give to, things that we support. And we just don't know of another ministry like yours, Jeffrey. So thank you for what you do. And we are just so privileged to be a part of it, even from afar. One day we will meet again, but until then.
Well, thank you, Millie. Yes, it would be wonderful to meet back live and in person, but even when we do, we'll continue the Zoom feature for those that are outside the area. We certainly have been very much blessed by having them involved in the ministry as well. Well, thanks for your comments. And, you know, I think we all realize that you know, I can't imagine knowing any Christian who doesn't believe that Black Lives Matter. It's the organization that is a Marxist, racist, frankly, a hate organization. And very cleverly, of course, they use that name. But we always want to be very, very cautious about that. And it's the organization, just like Antifa supposedly is an anti-fascist organization. Well, in fact, as you all know, it's as fascistic as anything you can imagine. So the left is very, very clever when it comes to packaging their agenda. And but nonetheless, for those who fail to make the distinction or would prefer not to make the distinction, we understand that Black lives and all lives matter, obviously, but it's the organization that is very toxic and frankly, very, very violent. The vast majority of violent riots have involved that organization along with Antifa. So with that, let's go back to our study. And last week, we took a look at the preface and the introduction to the book. And then we had very valuable commentary by David Tilley. And I hope you got the printed copy of Dave's remarks from last week. They were really excellent. A couple of points I wanted to reiterate, and then we'll move on into chapter 1 this evening. But I think a good launch point, and one that I constantly come back to, is this quote by R.C. Sproul that I cite several times in the book. And this should be a source of, well, this should be a great challenge to us all, where Sproul writes in his book, Lifestyles, I doubt if there has been a period in all of Christian history when so many Christians are so ineffectual in terms of shaping the culture in which they live, as is true right now in the United States. So unfortunately, those comments by him are true, and again, should be a source of not only embarrassment, but hopefully spur us on to be more bold in terms of being a source of light and love and truth, as Mark mentioned in his opening prayer. Also there in the preface, the quote by J. Budiashevsky, the University of Texas philosopher, who writes, "We are living through an eerie phase of history in which the moral truths that everyone knows are treated as if they are unheard of doctrines." He goes on to say, a time in which the elements of common decency are themselves attacked as indecent. And he goes on to write that nothing quite like this has ever happened before. And he's absolutely correct about that, because of the Christian influences in Western civilization over the last 2,000 years. There was sort of a common acceptance that certain things are right and wrong, proper and improper. And of course, we'll talk more about that in depth in just a few minutes as we get into the chapter on natural law. In the introduction, I talk about how how fragile our civilization truly is. In many respects, civilization is but a thin veneer of laws and customs, values and beliefs, integrated into our cultural traditions and institutions. Now, we oftentimes perceive that our civilization is very solid. In fact, and I think this year has proven conclusively, it's not nearly as solid as we suppose. In fact, it's very, very brittle. And every civilization, as I wrote, is a potential Pompeii that could easily be destroyed and buried beneath a proverbial ash heap by one great cataclysmic eruption, such as perhaps the cataclysmic eruption that awaits us with this upcoming election. I go on to make a couple more points related to America's culture war. Many Americans, many Christians, of course, minimize the significance of the culture war. Many Christians would assume that it's more Christ-like to function as a peacemaker than a culture warrior, or as a bridge builder rather than a wall builder. But the harsh reality is that not everyone shares a similar value system or a common vision. There are unfortunately two Americas, and these two Americas have goals that are contradictory and irreconcilable. I mean, if you watch the Republican National Convention a few weeks ago, and then the Democratic Convention the previous week, I think that so obviously clarified what's at stake here. What was represented in those two conventions was virtually two different worldviews, and they are irreconcilable worldviews. And in such situations in which truth and morality are at stake, peace is unattainable through compromise. See, so many Christians and conservatives in general, for that matter, want to be nice and tolerant and accepting, which we should certainly strive to be. But the other side, the secular left, they want to win. They want to win, and they want to win at any price. And it's no wonder who is winning and who has been winning for decades now. True peace can only be achieved when aggressive evil is contained. And so I finish up that introduction by mentioning that the culture war exists, whether we prefer to acknowledge it or not. Turbulent times call for people of courage and people of convictions who understand the issues at stake and are willing to engage the fight, because underneath the culture war is a great spiritual struggle. And on one side are those who believe in universal moral principles, as we'll talk later about. And on the other side are those who believe that everything, or they purport to believe, I should say, that everything is relative, everything's subjective, and everything is merely a matter of personal choice. But you notice that when they're promoting their secular left-wing agenda, they don't act as if they believe that is relative and subjective. So nobody really lives consistently with relativistic values. So anyway, just a brief recap of a couple of points that we emphasized last week in the preface and the introduction. Now, I'd like to start with a brief overview of Chapter 1 before we move on to the main course for tonight, which is Chapter 2 on natural law theory. But for those who are reading along, you know, Chapter 1's pretty short. It's, I think, about 12 or 15 pages. And the title of this chapter, and by the way, I should have mentioned, I assume you have the outline that we sent out. And if you have that outline, if you've printed it out, our remarks this evening will follow pretty closely along that outline. But the title of that chapter, number 1, is In the Beginning, the Origins of America's Culture War. And I start by talking about how many people believe that America's culture war began back in the 1960s with the emergence of the sexual revolution, the emergence of the New Left, the hippie counterculture movement, and so on. Others say, well, no, I don't think the culture war really started in the 60s. It probably goes back all the way to the 1920s in the aftermath of World War I. But as this chapter, I think, emphasizes, in fact, the origins of America's culture war actually predate all of that. They extend back to virtually the very beginning of American colonization. And from the outset, America, of course, is founded by people who come over primarily from England, not exclusively, but primarily from England, out of a variety of reasons. And for some, this would be a minority, but a very influential minority. It was religious liberty. For others, it was primarily an issue related to political freedom. They disliked living under the direct control of a tyrannical monarch, and they thought that there would be more political freedom here in America. Others come over for personal ambitions, such as social and economic opportunities. A few come merely for out of a sense of adventure. But then there are others, and this has oftentimes been overlooked in looking at the origins of colonization. Some came primarily for purposes that what I call libertine hedonism. In other words, they wanted to leave a very highly structured civilization behind so they could come over and live any way they pleased here in the New World. And that's basically the group that we'll be focusing on for a few minutes here as we talk about the origins of America's culture war. Now, just 4 years after the Pilgrims founded Plymouth Colony in 1620, the Pilgrims actually called themselves separatists. They believed that the Anglican Church in England was unredeemable, unreformable. And so they believed that true Christians would want to totally separate from the Church of England. There was another party of reformists, a much larger party, and they were called Puritans. And they believed that they could work within the Anglican Church and purify or reform that church. But these people who founded Plymouth Colony, they believed that the church was unreformable. And so they called themselves separatists. We call them pilgrims. And so they founded, as you know, Plymouth Colony in 1620. Now, just a few years after that, there's another colony founded a few miles up the coast of Massachusetts. And this is the colony of Mount Wollaston. Later, it changed its name to Marymount. And in contrast to the pilgrims who came to America, as you know, primarily for religious liberty, these people who settled Mount Wollaston or the Marymount colony had a totally different agenda. And so these two groups really exemplify the distinct and incompatible worldviews that will later be far more manifest in American history, and especially, of course, over the last 50 or 60 years of American history. And the tensions and conflict between these two groups really sets the stage for the first skirmish in America's ongoing and rapidly accelerating culture war. Now, I talk about the founder of that Marymount colony. His name was Thomas Morton. He recruited about 30 young men to come over with him and found this colony in 1624. Again, they settle about 20 miles north of Plymouth Colony. And Thomas Morton, like all the rest of them, would have identified himself as a Christian, because after all, back in those days, virtually everybody claimed to be a Christian. But the vast majority, of course, were merely what we would call cultural Christians or nominal Christians. But anyway, he certainly considered himself to be a Christian, but his agenda is totally different from that of the Pilgrims. Again, he wants to set up what we would call kind of a libertarian style colony. And so from the outset, there was a lot of tension between the colonists in Plymouth and those who were settling in Mount Wollaston up the coast. And there were issues related to their relations with the local natives that set them apart. But it was more kind of the hedonistic spirit of Thomas Morton's colony that most set the tensions between the two groups. Now, in 1628, 4 years after it was founded, that Mount Wollaston colony changed its name to Marymount, and Thomas Morton announced that on May Day there would be a special celebration. And what they did was organize a pagan-style, kind of Greek-style festival. And in the process of that, they erected a maypole. And as the account by the Plymouth governor, William Bradford, put it, they set up a maypole, drinking and dancing about it for many days, inviting Indian women as their consorts, dancing and frisking together, and even worse practices. And so this outraged the Pilgrims. They organized a preemptive strike on the Marymount colony. They chopped down the maypole. They also arrested Thomas Morton, and eventually he was driven out of the colony. Now, back in England, Morton was connected with some very highly placed people. So he managed to have Parliament revoke the charters of the Plymouth colony and the Massachusetts colony. Those were later reinstated. But anyway, he's carrying on basically a propaganda war against the Pilgrims and against the Puritans, who by that time have settled in Massachusetts as well. Now, the point here, and if you've read the chapter, you know there's a lot more details than I have time to relate, but one thing is clear here, and that is that from the beginning, America was beset by a culture war that represented two contrasting visions of what kind of a society and culture New England should be. And for some, they hoped to see New England become a model Christian society, governed by biblical principles of law and morality, Others saw it as a refuge from the religious and moral restraints of England. And so a century and a half later, the founding fathers sought an innovative compromise between these two visions. And our founding fathers, of course, established a constitutional representative style government that would maximize civil liberties. It would also disestablish the Christian religion, while correspondingly, it would acknowledge the benefits of religious liberty and promote the nation's Christian heritage. And so the founding fathers will create a national government that is religiously neutral, but they have absolutely no intention, of course, of establishing a secular government that's hostile to religion or even indifferent toward religion. So it's a very important distinction to make. Now, for several generations, that compromise that the founding fathers established more or less worked. But it worked because the Christian religious heritage and values kept the more secular and libertarian Enlightenment ideals in check. But with the accelerated pace of change in the 20th century and the increased secularization of American society and culture, the fissure separating these two contrasting worldviews widened until it opened up into a major chasm in the 1960s. And of course, today we see the unsettling effects of this rift in every aspect of American life. What we have today in America, in a very general sense, are two broad camps which represent irreconcilable worldviews. One side advocates values based on traditional natural law moral values, while the other side promotes a relativistic and secular humanistic agenda. And the areas of mutual agreement and commonality between the two continue to shrink. Again, if you watched both of the conventions a few weeks ago, I didn't see a whole lot of common values being expressed and shared between these two parties. And so America is being torn apart by these competing agendas. And as the author and radio talk show host Dennis Prager has noted, America will only be united when one of these worldviews prevails over the other. Again, the point being they are irreconcilable. You either believe in the sanctity of human life or you don't. There's not a middle ground on that. And many of the other dividing issues of our day, we can make a similar argument. So 50 years ago, if you think back to the 1960s or the turn of the 70s, most secularists in America were at least publicly and at least superficially respectful toward the Christian faith. But today, it's absolute full-scale and an unrelenting assault in the public square, not only on Christianity per se, but even the most basic common principles related to decency and civility, the principles on which natural law ethics are founded. So that's a very quick, very cursory overview of chapter 1. But as I said, we want to focus primarily this evening on the next chapter. But let me just pause very briefly. Are there any particular comments or questions, anything that could use some clarification before we move on? All right, well then let's do just that. Let's move on to chapter 2. In chapter 2, the title is Natural Law, the Moral Foundation for Social and Political Civility. And I want to start out with a brief overview of the first section, and then I want to turn to Dr. Michael Sabum for a commentary on this first part. But first of all, again, sort of a general overview of the first half of this chapter. Now, I think it's rather obvious that the America of the past is fading very fast. A culture war that was simmering mostly beneath the surface for many generations has erupted in the last several decades into a raging conflict that pits starkly contrasting and as I said, oftentimes irreconcilable worldviews, ideologies, and value systems against one another. And the effects of the culture war are apparent in almost every area of American society and culture. They're becoming, as our society is becoming increasingly polarized and dysfunctional. And by the way, this is why our political leaders seem so utterly incapable of handling even the most obvious problems, is because they're approaching all of this from two irreconcilable worldview perspectives. There's political gridlock today in Washington, D.C., because there's moral and cultural gridlock in American society. And the result, to cite a song that Bob Dylan recorded about 20 years ago, the result is that everything is broken. Now, the erosion of basic standards of honor and decency in our society is truly alarming. And it's affecting, as I said, every area of our culture, from law and politics to business, to education, to the media, the judicial system, the arts and entertainment, public behavior, certainly. Just think about how crude public behavior has become. And of course, that's merely a reflection of private morality as well. And in the process, the very character and the very nature of America is being radically transformed. We see it every day played out in the news. For cultural liberals, though, see, much of this change is cause for celebration. For cultural conservatives and people who have a fundamentally biblical perspective on things, what's going on in our society and culture is cause for great concern. As we've said before, America is truly a unique nation. There's never been one like it in all of human history. And we see it just absolutely coming apart at the seams. And of course, the pace of the unraveling seems to be quickening every year. So that being the case, the question would be then, is there any common ground between social conservatives and liberals when it comes to accepting a baseline for morality and ethics and civility? Now, in fact, there is, or there should be at least, and it derives from the universal principles that were generally accepted until recent times. And what we're talking about there is the concept of natural law. Now, let's talk for just a few minutes about what is natural law. And I spend several pages in the chapter kind of unpacking this, but just in brief, natural law is a kind of moral-based common sense. Think about that, moral-based common sense. It's basically a set of moral and ethical precepts that are universal and transcultural. So universal meaning that all of humanity has a sense of these principles. Now, whether they live up to them or not is a totally different matter. There is the issue, of course, of original sin that complicates things. But these basic principles of morality are what some philosophers refer to as the perennial philosophy, and what C.S. Lewis wrote about in Mere Christianity and another book, The Abolition of Man. And so Lewis, especially in The Abolition of Man, spends a lot of time focusing on this idea of natural law. And he says that if natural law concepts are rejected, then all value is rejected. Without an understanding of these basic precepts, basically society degenerates into a free-for-all, of drastically competing ideas about what's proper and improper, what's right and what's wrong, what's good and what's evil. Now, as Christians have conceptualized natural law, these precepts are expressions of absolute and eternal norms, and they're derivative from God's general revelation. And I quote from William Gardner's book, The Book of Absolutes, in which he talks about all normal human beings carry a compass, the compass of natural law within them. He says this is an innate sense concerning things like justice, fairness, equity, cheating, lying, love, courage, wisdom, and so on. And he calls this a transcendent standard that comes as a result of being created in the image of God. It's part of our human nature. Now, again, due to human sin, these principles are regularly ignored and violated. But as I said, that's a different issue. Now, when we look at the philosophical origins of natural law, we can trace this concept back to the great philosophers of classical Greece, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and so on. And of those, the most outstanding would be Aristotle. And Aristotle wrote most extensively on natural law theory, and he probably had the most influence on later Christian thinkers. And for Aristotle, civic laws, man-made laws, should not only express absolute principles, but they should also help shape character. And he would argue that without an understanding, and by the way, Aristotle, of course, as far as we know, had no understanding whatsoever of the biblical doctrine of the fall or anything like that. But Aristotle nonetheless understands that virtuous behavior is not normal in most societies. Virtuous behavior is not normal in most societies. And virtuous behavior, according to Aristotle, has to be inculcated through moral-based education and also through socialization in a society that upholds these basic principles. And also it needs to be upheld by the rule of law. Now, when you think about the mess that is America today, morally, culturally, and so on, think about the connection between the state of affairs that we are in and the lack of moral-based education that is prevalent in our schools. This is true not only for the overwhelming majority of public schools, but also for the great majority of private schools, even some Christian schools, where there's been this bifurcation, this disconnect between moral-based education and just the acquisition of facts and knowledge and so on. When we break that connection, then we are violating the very principles that hold a society together. We're also violating the principles that make for a quality human life. Now, on page 17 in the book, I have a chart, natural law, some basic principles, and I reproduce that, of course, in the notes, the outline notes we sent out as well. And I won't take the time to go through each of those, but let me just highlight a few of these principles. And first of all is this idea that there's a God, or at least some unifying principle, that's responsible for our existence and the maintenance of the universe. And furthermore, there is a moral law to which we are accountable. In other words, certain attitudes, certain speech, certain actions are objectively right and wrong, regardless of our preferences or our feelings about them. Certain things are absolutely right and wrong. Citizenship obligations to one society is another principle of natural law theory. The rule of law, think about how the rule of law has been savagely attacked just in the last several months. Well, the rule of law is an integral part of natural law theory. Sanctity of human life, the right of self-defense, property rights, and so on. Virtues such as wisdom and honor and courage and moderation, honesty in interpersonal relations, and so on. Respect for parents and ancestors and elders. Values such as kindness and compassion, mercy and forgiveness, and the others that you see there listed in the chart. These are just elemental principles of natural law, which I think anyone who really sets their heart and mind to living a quality life has to acknowledge, whether they do it, with full attentionality or not. Now, moving on, these are also principles that are reinforced in Scripture. The first chapter of Romans in particular, and also inferences in the second chapter of Romans, where the Apostle Paul comments on the concept of natural law. He doesn't use that term, but by the way, it was a well-known term in the time of the Apostle Paul. And the Apostle Paul writes in the first chapter of Romans that these are moral precepts that are written on the human heart. And as a result, we are all morally accountable before God for our thinking, our speech, our actions, and so on. In other words, as Paul puts it, we are without excuse. Certainly people regularly violate these principles, but as I said, that's a different matter from knowing that there are certain things that are right and wrong. We just choose to deliberately violate these principles, and that's an expression of the dark side of our human nature. But according to Paul, the value of this innate moral law is that it convicts us of sin, and it convicts us of our need for divine redemption. But of course, he goes on to emphasize in the rest of his epistle to the Romans that the moral law cannot save us from the consequences of sin. We can't earn salvation or anything like that by trying our best to live a moral life. Salvation is only attainable by grace through faith in Jesus Christ. And as you know, that's a major emphasis in his epistle to the Romans. Now, after the time of Paul, over the next several centuries, there are some Christian philosophers and theologians who will comment on this principle of natural law. Most outstanding would be Augustine of Hippo, who incorporates the concept of natural law into his moral philosophy. And then later it gets incorporated in Roman law, as Roman law is being increasingly influenced by the Christian faith. But the most outstanding example of a proponent of natural law between the time of the Apostle Paul and the Protestant Reformation would be Thomas Aquinas, the philosopher and theologian Thomas Aquinas. And he refines and transmits to the modern world these principles in a very, very effective way. And like the Apostle Paul, Thomas Aquinas emphasizes that we are made in the image of God, and therefore we have the moral law embedded within our human nature. All of truth is God's truth, and the moral law essentially comes to us by what we would call general revelation, and that is as a result of being created in the imago Dei, in the image of God. Now, for Aquinas, the starting point for any kind of moral theology is the doctrine of law. And the origin of every just law is what he calls the eternal law. And the eternal law is an expression of the character and the nature of God. And in other words, Aquinas would use this example. He would say, think of God as the sun and the eternal law as the sunlight. It emanates from the character and nature of God, and we all have a sense of that in our own being. Now, derivative, though, of that eternal law is natural law. And these are foundational principles of universal morality that, as Aquinas would put it, these are principles that guide the moral actions of human beings such that when obeyed, they lead humans to the proper end or the proper purpose in this world. In other words, it's these principles that guide and direct us as we're trying to follow God's will and purpose for our lives. And the primary goal of the natural law is purpose-driven. The ultimate purpose is to direct us toward the good, toward God. Now, natural law, however, as he points out, is in itself insufficient. It has to be accompanied by the divine law, which is a manifestation of the eternal law that's revealed in the new covenant, the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so as we live according to the principles of the gospel, the new covenant, we are working out what he calls the law of love in our lives as manifest by the golden rule and by the greatest commandment as Jesus articulated it. So natural law essentially is the gateway to the garden of the gospel, and all human beings are accountable to natural law. But government, having said that, government has absolutely no right, of course, to impose the highest level of law, divine law, upon society in general, because society in general is not Christian. So the highest law, the divine law, is for Christians. But that's not; those are not principles that we can force on society in general. And hence, natural law is about as far as we can go in insisting that certain people behave in such a way that promotes civility and decency. Now, I go on in the chapter to talk about how that the Protestant Reformation, even though it was a rebellion against so much of Roman Catholic history, Protestant reformers like Martin Luther and John Calvin nonetheless continued to uphold the principle of natural law. And that tradition continues on down to the time of the Enlightenment. And we'll stop briefly at this point because I would like to turn to Dr. Sabom for commentary on what we've just covered. Now, many of you are familiar with Dr. Michael Sabom. He is a retired cardiologist here in Atlanta. He is one of the foremost experts in the world on the phenomenon of near-death experiences. And Dr. Sabom has written a couple of books on this phenomenon. The last one is a book entitled Light and Death, One Doctor's Fascinating Account of Near-Death Experiences. And unlike a lot of early research into NDEs, near-death experiences, which were based almost exclusively on just anecdotal accounts by people, Dr. Sabom has really examined this phenomenon through scientific means. And so he's a dear friend, and looking very much forward, Mike, to your comments on how some of this relates to your research and so on. So,
Jeffrey, before you go on, this is George. I was able to get in finally.
Good, very good. I'm glad you're with us. All right, Dr. Sabom, and Mike, you are muted right now. There you go.
Muted. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much, Jeffrey, for the introduction and the interesting talk. And I am thoroughly enjoying your book. And I must say at the outset that many of the ideas, especially about natural law itself, which is a little bit out of my medical field, come from your book. And the readability of the book and the ability for me a medical doctor to understand that is quite good and to your credit. So as far as I'm concerned, your book is excellent. Tonight, after a brief opening statement, which will summarize a little bit about what you just said, my purpose in making these comments is to add real-life examples to the philosophical, theological, and social science theories of natural law. Principles of natural law correspond, as you've mentioned, to a biblical understanding of the general revelation of God as written by Paul in Romans 1. These principles are: 1, transcendent, meaning discovered, not invented by humans. 2, they are universal and unveiled within all people from divine truths written on their hearts, Romans 2:15, or to all people from what has been made. And Psalm 19, 1 and 2 and Romans 1:20 are very good examples of that statement. 3, they are foundational, as you have pointed out already, for rational thought and behavior. 4, they can be ignored and violated, but only without excuse, Romans 1:20. And 5, 20 of these natural law principles are outlined in your book very well on page 17, as you've already alluded to. The rest of my talk will consider the first 2. Principle 1 states, quote, there is a God or gods or some unifying power or principle that is responsible for the existence and maintenance of the universe, end quote. And the example I would like to use is the example I've used in previous talks in Enlightened Death. So I apologize to anybody who has heard this before, but perhaps I will go quickly through use and get on to the next, which I haven't talked about before. The case that I would like to talk about is A.J. Ayer. A.J. Ayer was a very noted 20th century atheistic philosopher. In the 1980s, he had a cardiac arrest for 4 minutes under medical observation in a hospital in England with successful resuscitation. During his period of unconsciousness, he had a deep, what I term transcendental near-death experience, as opposed to an autoscopic near-death experience where someone seemingly floats up out of their body and watches what's going on in the room. This is a trip to elsewhere, so to speak. Dr. Ayer characterized this as a very vivid, in his words, experience. He was confronted by an exceedingly bright red light, which he strongly felt was responsible for the government of the universe. The overall experience was like a badly fitting jigsaw puzzle, slightly out of joint. And he felt that the laws of nature, as he understood them, had ceased to function as they should. So there's some very unique qualities to this experience. First of all, it was uncomfortable. Second of all, he was distressed by the red light, and he felt like this shouldn't be happening, and described it, I think, perfectly as a badly fitting jigsaw puzzle of a transcendental near-death experience experienced by someone who does not believe in God, and has spent his whole life writing about that. His medical doctor, Jeremy George, returned to check on Ayer later that same day. Ayer told Dr. George, quote, I saw a divine being. I'm afraid I'm going to have to revise all my various books and opinions, end quote. According to Dr. George, quote, A.J. Ayer clearly said divine being. He was confiding in me, and I think he was slightly embarrassed because it was unsettling for him as a well-known atheist. He spoke in a very confidential manner. I think he felt he had come face to face with God or his maker. Now, you might wonder why Dr. George is divulging this confidential conversation. A.J. Ayer died several years ago, so I think he felt able to do that from a medical standpoint. I'm not sure they have HIPAA over in England, but that's where he's at. Following the near-death experience, and now we're back to A.J. Ayer, following his near-death experience, according to friends and family, he became, quote, so much nicer, not nearly so boastful, took an interest in other people, began spending a great deal of time with Father Frederick Copleston, noted Catholic philosopher and former debate opponent of Ayer's on the existence of God. So he had actually debated Copleston on whether God existed or not, and AJ was firmly against the idea. Quote, AJ, in the end and after the experience, Copleston, actually this is Ayer's wife, she said, in the end and after his near-death experience, Copleston was Ayer's closest friend, whereas before he was his debate opponent. It was quite extraordinary, and that was Ayer's own words. Thus, this is an example of an avowed atheist who spent his life writing about why there is no God, confronting a badly fitting jigsaw puzzle that was very real, and coming out of it saying, maybe I ought to change a few things that I wrote. Conclusion, thus God's existence was revealed to Ayer during the near-death experience, which caused Ayer to deeply question his own atheistic beliefs. His change in behavior for the good was noticed by all who knew him. It should be noted that these positive after effects of the near-death experience, even in atheists, have been shown to occur in multiple NDE studies, including my own. And Jeffrey has mentioned the fact that the general revelation is present in all men from all backgrounds, is transcultural. All you have to do is a breathing, thinking human being to have it. This then leads to, and this is the little sidebar to my own personal experience, because I'm one of the founding members of IANS, International Association of Near-Death Studies, and I am blamed as starting the religious wars within this organization, which is largely composed of non-Christians. We all believe in the general revelation portion of the near-death experience, but we don't all agree, very few of us agree with the Christian salvation that's necessary for the sin that we have in our life. And there is such a thing as a life review, where people sometimes go through in their experience bad things, good things that have happened to them, but they feel like that if they're non-Christians, they can work through this themselves, and they do not need a Christian savior. Light and Death covers a lot of that, by the way. Principle 2, there is a moral law to which we are accountable. Certain attitudes, speech, and actions are objectively right and wrong, regardless of our personal or subjective feelings about them. And I think you've already mentioned this. I found it very interesting in my studies for the near-death experience to come across a 3-volume book written and entitled The Criminal Personality. And this book was published in 1976, and it was written by Samuel Yokelson, who's an MD, PhD research professor at George Washington University, and Stanton Samanow, who's a PhD clinical psychologist. These two men came together because they had a common interest in the criminal personality, and they collected data from extensive interviews with 240 what they term, quote, hardcore criminals, end quote. In the volume 1, there's a section entitled Emergence of Non-Psychotic Hallucinatory Deterrence. I'll repeat that. Non-psychotic hallucinatory deterrence. Now, what in the world did they mean by that? They explained this way, quoting from their book. Early in our investigation, we learned that some criminals hear a voice speaking to them at critical times. We since have found this to be the case in more than half the criminals we see. Extreme care was taken to distinguish an actual voice from a corresponding thought. This voice does not distress the criminal. It is part of his life. The voice emerges for only a moment, just before and during a crime, but never afterwards. The voice is not a manifestation of psychosis. The criminal remains firmly in touch with reality, a necessity for the successful execution of the crime. Continuing with the quote, the voice urges him to refrain from committing the crime. In almost all cases, the criminal listens to the voice and heeds it, and thus many crimes are prevented. Most commonly, they are told, don't do it. The voice is often identified as a parent, God, Christ, or Allah in a Muslim. The voice seems to be a return of an internal deterrent or conscience that has been cut off by the criminal. The criminal does not talk about it spontaneously, since it would be a sign of weakness for him to tell others that hearing a voice sometimes prevents him from committing a crime. Conclusion. Thus, general revelation, which relates to God's existence and character, is made apparent to all humanity through, at times, a near-death experience or immediately before committing a crime. These two examples illustrate eternal norms which reside in our moral conscience and accord with the substance of natural law. That's it. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Mike. That is really fascinating. And do you mind sending to me? I wrote down the name of the book that you cited, The Criminal Personality, but I didn't get the authors. And
yeah, I'll write that to you.
Okay.
That's the book there, but I don't expect you to read it.
Well,
no, I mean, it's
it sounds like a very valuable resource.
Well, it is. I only own volume 1, by the way.
Okay, all right.
But I will be happy to give you the reference.
Because I'd like to just kind of send that out, to people in general who might be interested in at least reading, brief reviews of the book. That is really fascinating and a very interesting approach to confirming, these principles of natural law. These are not just esoteric concepts that somebody's come up with. I mean, they really are moral principles that are embedded in our soul, despite our sometimes our best efforts to suppress them. So very interesting. By the way, Mike, if you don't mind staying on for just a few minutes after 8:30, if people have some follow-up questions or comments for you. Thank you.
No problem. Yeah.
All right. Well, let's move on then to the second part of the chapter, and I'm just going to give about a 2-minute introduction before I turn the rest of the time over to George Weaver. Now, this is if you're following along in the book, or if you're following along in the outline notes. This is the section that starts with the Enlightenment revision. And the point here is that in America, the concept of natural law exerted a significant influence on colonial life and colonial values. But with the dawn of the Enlightenment, the so-called Age of Reason, and in America, you might say that in a general sense, the Enlightenment sort of dawned here in America, probably in the 1750s, 1760s, a few years before the American Revolution. But with the dawn of the Enlightenment, a more humanistic version of natural law begins to emerge. And at first, it's virtually undetectable, but there's a subtle shift that begins in the underlying philosophy of natural law from a moral code that's deducible from natural theology to one emanating from human reason alone. Now, probably the single most important person in this shift from natural law, traditional natural law, to Enlightenment era natural rights would be the great English philosopher, political philosopher, John Locke. And it was Locke primarily who redirects the ultimate objective of natural law from the traditional goal of moral principles that basically strengthen the commonweal or the common good of society, to one focused more on individual rights. So we go from principles that are basically employed in order to, again, have a well-functioning, moral, decent civil society, to more of an emphasis on individual rights. And so by the time of the American Revolution, this new interpretation of natural law, with its emphasis on inalienable individual rights, is becoming sort of the jurisprudential common sense of the day. And it's also an integral part of a whole socio-political ideology that's emerging that we refer to as classical liberalism, or a better word, I think, today would be Republican-style government. Now, when we use that term, by the way, classical liberalism, many of you are aware of the fact that classical liberalism has virtually nothing in common with contemporary liberalism. In fact, classical liberalism is far more in accord with contemporary conservatism. So these are just man-made terms, and the meaning of these terms, of course, change over time. Now, in America, these ideas that are propagated by John Locke and some other European intellectuals, these principles are most evident in our own Declaration of Independence, authored, of course, by Thomas Jefferson, and especially Jefferson's emphasis on, as he puts it in the second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, where we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, among these being life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And again, in your outline notes there, and if you're following along in the book, page 29, you see a chart there that I put together that contrasts traditional natural law principles with Enlightenment era natural rights, a comparison. And for instance, and again, I'll just be very brief here, what is the basis of authority? Well, for traditional natural law, it was the divine will working in conjunction with human reason. For Enlightenment natural rights, it's human will and reason alone. What about the epistemic basis? In other words, the basis for knowing what the moral law is. In traditional natural law, it was general revelation as a result, again, of being created in the image of God and our own intuition. Now, in Enlightenment natural rights, the epistemic basis was written in legal codes and characters. What about human law? Well, according to traditional natural law, human law should conform to absolute moral principles, as we've been talking about. But with Enlightenment natural rights, human law should conform to the will of the people. And you might think, uh-oh, that sounds a little shaky, to say the least. The main objective in traditional natural law is the common good. for natural rights, it's individual freedom and happiness. You can see there's differences there in terms of their understanding of human nature. For traditional natural law, it's that human nature is corrupt and needs to be regulated by absolute moral principles. In Enlightenment era natural rights, human nature is perceived to be good by nature, but it's been corrupted by bad social and political systems. So the intention there and the goal is to create better, more just, more humane, more decent political and social structures, which of course the founding fathers were certainly committed to doing. And then if you look at the last point here in that chart, the political system. Under traditional natural law, the political system should reflect the realities of moral law and human nature. Human nature in terms of all the great human potential that's within us, but also the great proclivity for selfishness, egoism, and sin that's a part of human nature. In other words, a balanced, realistic understanding of human nature. But with Enlightenment natural rights, the political system should reflect the will of the people. And that's not only a sobering, it's a rather chilling prospect that we would want a legal system that reflects the will of the majority of the people. Again, I think just watching the news on a regular basis should be cause for great concern when it comes to a principle like that. So continuing from there, we have the emergence of something called legal positivism in the late 1800s up to the present time. And this is where I'd like to turn it over to George Weaver. And many of you, of course, know George. George has had a very successful, productive legal career. And George is also an author. And several years ago, he published this book, wrote and published this book entitled The Significant Life, Overcoming Your Fear of Being Unnoticed and Forgotten. This is a wonderful book. I would highly recommend it. And so George, with that, I'll just turn it over to you. And looking forward to your comments.
Okay, thank you, Jeffrey. By the way, the new edition of that little book is called Significant Me, ? Our Need to Be Noticed and Remembered. Anyway, on the subject of natural law, I've practiced law for many years, and I am on the glide path to retirement. I'm hoping I don't crash on the runway. But Jeffrey asked me to read the material, and I have also read his other little booklet on natural law. And I reread the material in this American Crisis book that Jeffrey just came out with. And so I don't think there's a whole lot to add, but let me make a few comments. I think that the idea of natural law is that there is a realm of divine command ethics. And that is, I think, a standard Christian viewpoint, and also a viewpoint of Judaism, and I believe other monotheistic religions like Islam, that God has a nature and a character, and that there are certain moral standards implicit in his nature and character. And our job as humans, when we make law, is to try to reflect or implement, to the extent that we can, these divine standards. Of course, this gets into the area of morality, moral philosophy, and ethics, and even arguments for the existence of God. As you know, one of the primary arguments for the existence of God, I'm thinking of the Christian God, is the moral argument that C.S. Lewis makes and other people have made, that because there are objective moral standards, there must be a source, and the only reasonable conclusion is that there's a God whose character contains these moral standards. So let me show you a little PowerPoint here. Can you see that?
I do not.
Okay, let me try again. I'll come back to this in a minute. Anyway,
You have to share your screen.
yeah, I know, that's what I tried to do.
No, Jeffrey has to share the screen.
Okay, okay, all right.
No, Jeffrey does not need to share his screen.
Oh.
Just George.
Just me, okay, all right. Anyway, I'll keep fiddling with that while we're talking here.
And
But,
George, you are sharing your screen now. We can see it.
Oh, you see it? Okay, all right.
Yes, we can.
Okay, all right, it takes a minute. So anyway, this is just a rough illustration of what we're talking about here. And the particular question that I'm interested in is, what should a judge do in view of this concept of natural law? And I think we all agree that human law, man-made law, should reflect or mirror divine standards. Without that, you really don't have any binding, enduring, or stable law. It reduces to either pleasure or somebody's utilitarian calculation, or some view of a moral contract, which is, of course, hypothetical. There is no real moral contract. That, I mean, when you were born, you don't recall signing a contract, do you? So we have natural law, and Jeffrey talks about how this relates to divine law and God's character. And then we have man-made law. In our system, Jeffrey just talked about the fact in the Declaration of Independence that, that the government's supposed to derive its just powers from the consent of the governed. And of course, Abraham Lincoln said that in the Gettysburg Address that here we have government of the people, by the people, and for the people. So we have citizens who mandate or influence the enactment of legislation, and it is approved or vetoed by an executive. And then the theory is that we have judges who interpret and apply these laws that are made through this process. So one thing I think that we need to have clear is that in our system, we shouldn't just turn a judge loose to impose his view of what he sees as natural law. And Jeffrey mentioned Robert Bork in his book here. Robert Bork, of course, was the very highly qualified legal scholar who was a professor at Yale and then was a judge on the DC Circuit and appointed by Ronald Reagan in 1987 to the Supreme Court. And he was defeated in a very bitter battle in the US Senate. He was not confirmed. And by the way, the opposition was led by Ted Kennedy and Joe Biden. Joe Biden was the chairman of the Judiciary Committee that defeated Bork, or recommended he be not confirmed, and then the full Senate voted not to confirm him. Anyway, Bork, in this book, he wrote a couple of books. He passed away a few years ago, but this book is called The Tempting of America. And Bork was very concerned that judges had strayed away from their obligation to interpret and enforce law made by the legislative and executive branches, the political branches of government. And in this book, Bork says that it's a mistake to say that a judge should be allowed to rule in a particular case just based on his understanding of natural law. And I think he's right. Bork says on page 66 of this book, The Tempting of America. He says, I am, quote, I am far from denying that there is a natural law, but I do deny that both we have given judges the authority to enforce it and that judges have any greater access to that law than do the rest of us. Judges, like the rest of us, are apt to confuse their strongly held beliefs with the order of nature, close quote. Then he also says later in this book, page 209, he criticizes a Stanford University law professor named Thomas Gray, who, quote, urged courts to depart from the written Constitution on the theory that there's an unwritten law, a natural law that judges should enforce. And I think you can see the danger of this. If I'm an attorney and I have a case involving, let's say, a constitutional challenge to laws that forbid physician-assisted suicide, or forbid polygamy, or forbid incest, or prostitution. I can imagine some attorneys arguing to the court that as a matter of natural law, you should rule that this conduct in question here is protected. It's part of natural law that people be free to do these things, and therefore you should strike down the law in question as unconstitutional, as violating these very vague rights, and like in the 14th Amendment, the right to equal protection and the right to due process. But Bork points out, and I think he's correct, that that kind of thinking really, it allows judges to impose their own personal social agendas on society under the guise of constitutional construction. I wanted to make that point. And in this slide you're looking at now, what I'm saying here is that natural law should influence citizens and voters when they vote for political candidates and in referenda. And I think it should also influence legislators because they're not interpreting and applying pre-existing law, they're making law. And it should also influence executives when they decide whether to sign or veto a law or lobby for a particular statute. But when it comes to judges, I'm uncomfortable, and Robert Bork is uncomfortable with saying a judge should be free to impose his understanding of natural law. Instead, I think a judge should be bound to follow I'm an originalist, the original meaning of the text of the law, whether it's constitutional or statutory. And there are many examples of how judges have failed to do that. You know, the marriage decision in 2015, Obergefell versus Hodges, where our friend Justice Anthony Kennedy and 4 other members of the court just invented out of thin air a constitutional right to same-sex marriage. And then just this past summer, in a case from Georgia, Bostock versus Clayton County, the Supreme Court, in a 6-3 decision written by Justice Gorsuch, one of Trump's appointees, not interpreting the Constitution, but interpreting a statute, part of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, held that the term, the language, because of sex, in Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which forbade employment discrimination because of certain prohibited factors, including because of sex, that even though nobody understood this at the time, that included gender identity and sexual orientation. And I was surprised at that decision. I think a lot of other conservative attorneys and observers were surprised at that decision. But I don't know to what extent Gorsuch thought he was following some kind of natural law principle. The other thing I'd like to comment on, and I know it's about time for the class to wrap up here, is the question of should Christians try to influence public policy? And Jeffrey says in his book, and he just repeated, that we have to be careful that we don't take our understanding of natural law and try to impose it on society. But what I think we have to keep in mind is this, that in our form of government, that Christians, along with everybody else, atheists, agnostics, Muslims, Jehovah's Witnesses, Buddhists, all have a right to have input into the making of public policy. And if Christians put in their views about whatever, prostitution, incest, physician-assisted suicide, the system produces a compromise. And so a Christian who has input is not imposing his standards on society. He's simply having input into the process. And I think that's important for us to keep in mind. I guess I would add one more thing here. I think the Supreme Court, and this is a little bit of a footnote, Justice Kennedy, I mentioned, he is the champion of gay rights, of course. Everything from a case back in the 90s, the Romer case, all the way through the Obergefell marriage case in 2015. But he has been the champion of gay rights. And he said in a decision in 2003 in Lawrence versus Texas, which overturned the criminal statute in Texas and Georgia, by the way, that forbade homosexual conduct, not orientation, but conduct. He said that it's not a proper purpose of the law to express moral disapproval. And that was shocking to me 16 years earlier in the case of Bowers versus Hardwick, where the Supreme Court upheld the Georgia sodomy statute. And I worked on that case when I was at the Georgia Attorney General's office. It was assigned to me. Anyway, in that case, Byron White, Justice White, wrote the majority opinion and said that the law is, quote, constantly based on notions of morality. And there's nothing wrong with a statute being based on moral standards, which is the whole concept of natural law, by the way. Anyway, Kennedy comes along 16 years later and says it's not a proper purpose of law to express moral disapproval. If that's true, then it's not a proper purpose of law to reflect moral standards or express moral approval. So by the time of Anthony Kennedy in 2003 in Lawrence versus Texas, a majority of the court had completely separated the idea of moral standards as in natural law from positive law or the law that we have to follow in our daily lives. To me, that was a tragedy, and we're still feeling the effects of it, including the marriage decision in 2015.
Well, the failure to distinguish or the failure not to acknowledge that all laws are moral based, I mean, that would apply as much to murder as to anything else, correct? I mean,
yes,
we're making a moral decision when we have laws that prohibit murder. So the very idea that a supposedly well-educated legal expert like Anthony Kennedy could come up with such an absurd comment as that, it just defies not only reality but imagination in many respects. If you haven't had a chance to read the second half of chapter 2, I would highly encourage you to do so. It correlates, of course, in our outline notes to pages 10, 11, and 12. And I'll just make one more brief comment before we close things out formally. But George, if you wouldn't mind staying on for a few minutes.
Sure.
for questions and comments and so on. Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. There on page 10 in your outline notes, you see beginning in the late 19th century, we have the emergence of what's called positive law or legal positivism, new intellectual trends. And these are based on principles of relativism and secularism, certainly. A very pragmatic, utilitarian, relativistic theory of jurisprudence derived from social customs and so on, rather than from the principles of natural moral law. And the result there, as you see in your outline, is a radical shift in the underlying philosophy of Western jurisprudence. In other words, the premise here would be that laws are merely man-made. They're certainly not divinely sanctioned. And so these laws should reflect the will of the majority in keeping with the democratic ideals and modern progressive trends. And you see some of the leading exponents or proponents of that, Jeremy Bentham, but in particular, Oliver Wendell Holmes here in America. And it becomes the dominant jurisprudential philosophy in the 20th century. In fact, and George could correct me here if this is not true, I believe there are very, very few law schools, is my understanding, that teach natural law theory or at least endorse natural law theory anymore. This issue came up in the Clarence Thomas confirmation hearing as well, as Thomas had based some of his decisions on natural law. And I'll end with this excerpt from Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail. I'm sure many of you have encountered this in the past, but I think this would be a good point on which to close out our formal session. And the issue is essentially, how do we determine a just law from an unjust law? And basically, King was saying, frankly, it's not that hard to make this delineation. And at the time, Martin Luther King was in the Birmingham jail for leading civil rights demonstrations. I believe this was 1963. And he was being criticized by some local pastors for advocating breaking the law. And so he writes this very eloquent statement as an apologetic for his actions in leading these demonstrations. And you can follow along there. This is merely an excerpt from it, of course. Quote, "You express a great deal of anxiety over our willingness to break laws. Now, this is certainly a legitimate concern. Since we so diligently urge people to obey the Supreme Court's decision of 1954 that outlawed segregation in public schools, it may seem rather paradoxical for us to consciously break laws." In other words, King is saying we need to uphold the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision that desegregated public schools, and yet he's saying that we need to violate certain laws in the South, Birmingham, and so on, in terms of these civil rights demonstrations. He goes on to say, "One may well ask, how can you advocate breaking some laws but obeying others?" Well, the answer lies in the fact that there are two types of laws. There are just and unjust laws. I would be the first to advocate obeying just laws. One has not only a legal but a moral responsibility to obey just laws. Conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. I would agree with St. Augustine that an unjust law is no law at all. And then he concludes this section by saying, now what's the difference between the two? Is it just merely my opinion or arbitrary or what? How does one determine whether a law is just or unjust? And King says very simply and rightly, I believe, a just law is a man-made code, a man-made law that squares with the moral law or the law of God. In other words, it squares with natural law. An unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law. To put it in the terms of St. Thomas Aquinas, an unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in eternal law and natural law. An unjust law is a human law that is out of sync with the eternal law and natural law. Any law that uplifts human personality is just. Any laws that degrade human personality is unjust. All segregation statutes are unjust because segregation distorts the soul and damages the personality. It gives the segregator a false sense of superiority and the segregated a false sense of inferiority. And he goes on, and again, this is just a brief excerpt from his letter from Birmingham jail. I would highly encourage you to look that up on the internet and read the full text. It's really quite well thought out, quite eloquent, and so on. And in that, of course, King is essentially enforcing this traditional concept of natural moral law, that there are certain principles related to right and wrong that are embedded within our soul as a result of the Imago Dei, as a result of being created in the image of God with a moral conscience. That's an integral part of what it means to be a human being. So there's a little bit more, but we'll stop at this point. And again, I would encourage you to read the rest of chapter 2 if you haven't done so yet. But next week, we'll go directly into chapter 3, which I think you'll find to be extremely helpful and enlightening and informative in terms of the philosophical and the historical bases for cultural Marxism and political correctness, the scourges of our modern society today. Where did all these insidious ideas that we see being played out constantly in the news every day, where did this stuff come from? And so that's part 1 of a 2-chapter sequence that I think, like I said, will not only reveal the origins of all this, but I think you'll find it to be extremely engaging reading through that. So thank you very much, Mike, and thank you very much, George, and for your contributions to the discussion this evening. And if you need to cut away, please don't feel hesitant to do so. But if you'd like to stay on for about 10 more minutes or so, why don't we open it up for any relevant questions or comments related to the topic this evening, either to me or to George or to Mike.
This is Jay. I have a question to Mike. Mike, I don't know if you remember me. I was with you at the discipleship class about 10 years ago under John Musselman. At that time, you gave me one of your book, and I became a student of near-death experience since that time. So I read a number of different books by the people who have that NDE experience. But one of the most challenging book that I run into was the book that was written by Dinesh D'Souza in 2009, based on his ex-wife, Dix's experience of the out-of-body experience. It was different from all the other books that was written on NDE in the sense that he was not describing the experience of the NDE, but he set out to prove that the near-death experience is possible, maybe not probable. And his approach was not from the experience point of view, but also it's from the point of view of the physics and biology, psychology, brain science, and things like that. My question is that I don't know if you read that book, and if you did, what do you think of that book?
Oh, by the way, this is the book.
Yeah, that's the one. Yeah.
Life After Death: The Evidence by Dinesh D'Souza.
I read that book about 3 times, but it's still over my head. I still do not fully understand it, so that's why I'm asking you that question.
Mike, you're muted.
I do have the book. I have not read it through. He did, I think it's a book that he referred to some of my work. I can't respond to it specifically. To me, if you scientifically look at the near-death experience, the only verifiable part of it is the out-of-body or autoscopic NDE. And then you have the problem of interpretation, fabrication, anecdotal, etc. And there have been 3 or 4 studies where they put signs, numbers, stuff like that in obscure places in the emergency room. And bottom line is they've all come up with 0. So it's still an open question. And I forget what Dinesh Souza's conclusion was, but that's about all I can say. I'm currently in the process of investigating that and going over the more recent research. I think we can get pretty close to evidence, but there's never going to be proof that these experiences are what many people say are afterlife experiences. I personally, and I think in the talk that I gave for Aragopolis last year, do not believe that these are glimpses of an afterlife, both theologically and scientifically, but many people do. And in fact, the people who have the experience often believes that they do also. So, but to look at scripture, to look at the scientific evidence, my conclusion on that so far is that that is not an afterlife experience. It's occurring during the process of dying, but not after the moment of death itself.
By the way, in Dinesh's book, he does cite you a couple of places, and he writes that Christians need not worry that NDEs, near-death experiences, somehow undermine mainstream religious beliefs. Most significant for Christians and other believers, Dr. Sabom and other researchers consistently report that, quote, NDEs seem to produce a stronger faith and a higher level of commitment to traditional religious practice.
I think the experience encourages and deepens spirituality, but I don't believe that it's an afterlife experience. I forget when that book was published.
2009.
I'm sorry?
2009.
2009. Well, that was after 2004 when the famous Heaven Tourism with Don Piper, 90 Minutes in Heaven book came out. And then there was a whole spate of books after that that kind of piggybacked on top of that. I personally have researched Piper's book and several others, and at some point am going to hopefully write or publish a response or a rejoinder within the Christian community, because many Christian churches, etc., have bought into the fact that these are true afterlife experiences.
Yeah, it's very unfortunate that those got so much publicity and attention. I'm going to ask the next question, and then we'll just open it up again. I wanted to ask George. I had made the comment that very few law schools teach natural law anymore, or at least present it as a credible theory. What would be your response to that? I mean, did you study natural law in any depth when you were in law school?
I took a class in jurisprudence, also known as legal philosophy. It was not a required class, it was an elective. And the concept was discussed in there. And one of the terms that was used was legal realism, which is similar, if not equivalent, to legal positivism And one of the big proponents I know of legal realism was Oliver Wendell Holmes. You mentioned him, a justice on the U.S. Supreme Court for many years. And under legal realism, the view is that the law is just what we humans say it is, and there's nothing more to it than that.
George, isn't that wasn't he sort of the beginning of setting that tone for law schools? It seems like I remember reading that somewhere.
I think it has had a big influence. I'm not really up to speed on what law schools are teaching now. In the standard curriculum that you would have, like you have a class on contracts and criminal law and torts and so forth, you don't talk about this. But if you take a class in jurisprudence or legal philosophy, you would get into this question. And I would imagine that the typical law school nowadays would teach that, would teach from the viewpoint of legal realism or legal positivism, that the law consists only of what humans produce, and there's not a higher realm that we're trying to reflect or implement. Now, there are some Christian law schools that have been started since I was in law school. I finished law school a long time ago, but there are several that started since then, and I would imagine they teach something different. You know, one is, I guess there's one at Liberty University, which is maybe under a cloud now. Regent University, Pat Robertson. There's
George Mason, I believe.
George Mason.
I believe it, yes.
Stanford.
I don't know to what extent it's considered a Christian law school, but there's
conservative. Yeah.
A Catholic one, but I forget the name of it. Then there's one in California, the Simon Greenleaf or Trinity Law School. So there's several. I would imagine that they would teach natural law.
Okay, thank you.
Stanford and Birmingham.
Any other questions or comments?
So I have a question for, was sort of a question comment for George, and then I'm just going to mention something that kind of pertains to our discussion tonight. So for the comment kind of question for George, maybe it's the legal realism. I don't think it ties into natural law. It just seems to me that the way things are going with the Supreme Court, that in general, it seems that the four we'll say left-wing justices, their decisions are pretty much predictable, except for occasional cases where it seems like a few of them have come down supporting some aspect of religious liberty or something. There's been an occasional case where it seems like they're almost unanimous. But in general, when there's a case, especially ones that involve seems like religion or sex in some way, discrimination of some type, it's almost a given. You know what the four left-wing judges are going to do. The reason being because they're actually voting based on their preferences, not on what the law says. It's not anything based on natural law, I don't think, or on legal precedents, but it seems to be based on their preferences as to how the law should read. And because we have an idea what their agenda is, we can predict how they will vote. It's really only a question of whether they can persuade, especially I think Kagan tries to do this, persuade one of the others like Gorsuch to go along with their reasoning and kind of pull them over to their side. So I was just going to mention that and get your thought about that. And before I hear your comment, let me just mention to everybody, including Jeffrey, that Dennis Prager had a column today in townhall.com, and I heard him talking about this on the radio yesterday. Said he used to believe the left had a moral compass that was displaced or abnormal. He's come to believe they have zero moral compass whatsoever. So you might want to check that out on the townhall.com.
Their moral compass isn't broken.
Yeah,
they don't have one at all.
They don't have one.
Okay.
So anyway, but George, what would you say about the Supreme Court as far as how it's making decisions today? How are they deciding?
Well, I think you're right, Paul, that by and large, the majority of the court is basically legislating personal preferences or social agendas of the justices. And we mentioned some of the cases. Of course, the abortion decisions fit into that understanding. Roe versus Wade, and since then, decisions basically upholding abortion on demand with some nuances. And, you know, Scalia, Antonin Scalia, he argued, I think persuasively, that the court was just inventing rights, the right to abortion on demand, and that the Constitution had nothing to say about the issue. And he said the same thing. The marriage decision came down shortly before he died in 2015. He died in 2016, and he said, you know, this would have seemed unbelievable, unimaginable in the recent past, that the court would invent a right to same-sex marriage. And I agree. That is nothing but raw judicial power. In fact, this book I mentioned, Robert Bork's book, The Tempting of America. By the way, the seat that he lost on the Supreme Court was taken by Anthony Kennedy in 1980.
Yeah, right. Yes.
Kennedy was the third choice of Reagan. It was Bork and then Douglas Ginsburg who withdrew, and then it was Kennedy. And I think Kennedy has been a total disaster. Of course, he's off the court now.
Right.
But anyway, Kennedy and Casey in Planned Parenthood versus Casey in 1992, people thought that Kennedy was going to vote to overturn Roe versus Wade. And according to the paper, Blackmun, who of course wrote Roe versus Wade, the majority opinion in 1973, in Blackmun's papers that were disclosed, I guess, after his death, he says that Kennedy changed his vote, that Kennedy was going to vote to overturn Roe, and he changed his vote. And he cited stare decisis, which is a principle that courts follow, although to be cynical, they follow it when they think it is convenient. It means that they follow precedent and they don't overturn precedent unless circumstances have changed. So Kennedy came along in 1992, Anthony Kennedy, and said, well, we can't overturn precedent. We have to follow stare decisis. Of course, a footnote, in Lawrence versus Texas in 2003, Kennedy wrote the majority opinion overturning Bowers versus Hardwick, and precedent had didn't carry any weight at all. Stare decisis didn't count. And Scalia pointed that out in his dissent in Lawrence versus Texas. But I agree that the court is engaged in wholesale legislation. And I used to think that the Supreme Court consisted of very smart people who were doing their best to follow the law, but increasingly I've concluded that they are just intent, a majority anyway, is intent on imposing their personal social viewpoints.
Right.
Yeah, that's a rational conclusion you've drawn. We have time for maybe one more question for Dr. Sabum or for George Weaver. So, any other comments?
Well, I'll point out that it seems like, I can't remember the case, but I think there was a case that was decided this spring where maybe they didn't follow the stare decisis, the precedent idea, and I think Justice Thomas brought that to their attention in his whatever, maybe it was probably a dissent, I can't remember, and and some people have said he's laying the ground for overturning Roe versus Wade, because he's pointing out that, okay, you're saying it's okay to overturn a previous precedent, and just wait, we have one down the line that we might want to overturn.
Yeah, and it's, as George mentioned, I mean, it's been done numerous times in court history.
Of course, well, we still have Dred Scott.
Right. Bob, we'll end here with Bob Harsh. I think, Bob, you had a comment or question.
Yes, this is for you, Jeffrey. I really appreciate your this second half of this chapter on especially the legal positivism, because I haven't ever thought about these ideas at all. But we're all surprised at what's going on in the country as far as it's people that seem to believe in anarchism. I don't, you know, if it was just a few leaders, that's one thing, but it seems like there is quite a number. So what I'm seeing is an evolution from going with the natural law to legal positivism, and the anarchist could care less about what society feels is right and wrong. And so they have personal, amoral, if you want to call it that, personal amoral values that they hold to, and they think that we are wrong. I really do think that they think we are wrong on, and so the evolution of this has to go from God to society now to just the personal.
Yes, good observation, Bob. And so if everything is relative, including law, then there really are no boundaries and so on. Yeah, we're living in this has been an unprecedented year, to say the least, in American history, where the rule of law is broken down all over the country with absolutely no intent on the part of local mayors, district attorneys, and governors to enforce it out of fear that they'll be charged with, racism or something like that, even though most of the hellraisers are whites who are associated with Antifa. But Black Lives Matter is also a prominent factor, as you know, in all of this. Nobody is really an anarchist. Anarchy is really only a means to an end. And it's just a means of tearing down our structures and rule of law and tearing down civilization so that it can be replaced with something else. And the something else, of course, would be a radical secular socialist system, a neo-Marxist system. But we're all familiar with the adage that nature abhors a vacuum, and anarchy is a vacuum. It's the elimination of law and order and civility and that sort of thing. But it's only a very, very temporary condition, because it's going to be filled with some authority. And these are just people who, by their own admission, hate America. They were chanting just a week ago or so, "Death to America." I guess they got that very clever chant from the jihadists in Tehran or something. But it's merely a means to an end. And they hate everything about traditional America, which would include not just capitalism, but far more important would be the Christian influences in traditional America. And so oftentimes they'll admit that it's Christianity and Christian moral values that are their ultimate target, you know. And I'll end on this. The great shame is that we have so few church leaders these days who have the courage to address these issues. And of course, what they'll do is claim, well, this is politics, and we don't want to get involved in politics. Politics is dirty and messy and whatever. And of course, we all know that politics is dirty and messy. It's also absolutely essential. And so let's insist. And by the way, these so-called political issues that they want to avoid are overwhelmingly moral issues. So this is tantamount to saying there are certain moral and ethical issues that we just won't talk about in church. And of course, that's very irresponsible, to say the least. And so we started out tonight, Andrea, talking about the pastor of her and Eric's church down there in Milledgeville, who is doing a series on the culture war and cultural apologetics. You know, I wish there were thousands or tens of thousands more like him who have the courage to address these issues. This is how you lose the culture war. Only one side is fighting, and it's the secular left that's fighting. So we'll end on that slightly less than positive note, but a note of realism nonetheless. So again, thank you, Mike, and thank you, George, for your contributions this evening. And so next week we'll take up chapter 3, and we'll spend the entire session on just that one chapter. So hope you have a productive week, and let's do everything possible this week to be a source of light and love and truth in the midst of a society that's growing very resistant to light and love and truth. So God bless you all, and look forward to reconvening next Wednesday evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.